Storage seat. Would you like an extra mic? Yeah, we'll talk about some just have it around. Perfect, thank you. All right, everyone. So I think we're gonna get started. Just started a little late, but we'll be finishing on time because we do got folks that need to run to other meetings. So we'll be sure to finish up. So welcome again to the legislative panel. And so in this panel, we're going to be discussing in general, kind of talking about the legislative process, like how ideas turn into bills, bills turn into laws, and then kind of go through maybe some examples of laws, and then how community plays a role in the process, in the entire process. And so my name is Omar Santana Gomez. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the legislative director with the Office of Equity. And so we got a great panel of folks that are experts and have this information that we're going to be going over today. And so I'm going to do some introductions for folks. And so honestly, just to get started too, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some quick introductions for our panelists and then guide an intro question so we can get to know our panelists a little bit more. All right. And then so the other piece I want to mention is we'll be, with time permitting, we'll be allowing some time at the end for questions from the audience, our folks that are here in person, and our virtual folks that we have on the Zoom call with us this morning. Okay, so we'll just get started. And I do have my notes too for bio, so I'm just going to be reading off of those just to make sure I get everything correct. All right, and so for introductions, so we have Amy Martinez in our on our panel today. So Amy is the Chief Executive Officer of the South Central Workforce here in Yakima. Amy holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Social Services from Central Washington University and possesses over 23 years of workforce training experience. Amy's early career started as a case manager, and she has successfully transitioned to higher level positions, currently serving as a Chief Executive Officer with South Central Workforce. Currently, Amy directs all program operations, oversees local strategic planning, leads local business development efforts, and is responsible for the oversight of an annual operating budget of over $18 million. Throughout her tenure at the South Central Workforce, she has successfully performed key functions that include development of grant proposals, procurement of service providers, administrative policies and procedures, monitoring and development, the implementation of discretionary programs. Welcome, Amy. And then we have Senator Rebecca Saldana, representing the 37th Legislative District. And I've mapped it out a little bit. So if I get some things wrong, please, please correct me. So this includes the Central District in Seattle, Chinatown International District, down to Rainier Beach. Senator Saldana is the Washington State Senate Deputy Majority Leader and represents the 37th District. She is a proud Chicana and Mexican and Germanic roots who grew up in the Delridge neighborhood of Seattle and has lived and worked primarily in Seattle and Oregon. During her tenure in the Senate, Senator Saldana has used her experience and expertise to spearhead legislative efforts to increase equity for historically oppressed communities, protect workers' rights, encourage sustainable development, build equitable transportation solutions, and increase voter access to elections. Welcome, Senator Saldana. And then we have with us locally, we have Representative Chris Corey, representing the 14th Legislative District, which covers parts of Yakima County and all of Clitcat County. Rep. Corey serves as the Assistant Minority Floor Leader for the House Republican Caucus. He also serves as Chair of the Pension Funding Council, Vice Chair of the Joint Employment Relations Committee and the Appropriations Committee, Consumer Protection and Business Committee, and Joint Legislative Unanticipated Revenue Oversight Committee. In his time in the legislature, he has focused on issues such as public safety, education, and economic development. Rep. Corey believes in community and volunteers with several local nonprofits, such as the Salvation Army and Crime Stoppers of Yakima County. He also serves as a board member for the Central Washington Fair Association. Welcome, Rep. Corey. All right, and so kind of to get a little more introduction into our panelists, I have an intro question for folks. So the intro question is, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, where you are from, what brought you to the role, and how you hold the role you hold now, and what you are passionate about in the work that you do? So please, whoever wants to get us started.
Okay, can you hear me? Oh, yeah. Okay, yes. So, yeah, Amy Martinez again. So I was raised in small little town in Grant County. Anybody ever heard of the town of Mattawa? Yeah, tiny little town. So a little agricultural town. And I was a child of poverty. And so then it just brought me to look at workforce, worked in the fields when I was younger, learned Spanish, of course. I to go to college, I had to play sports. So I played sports and went to Walla Walla Community College and then went to Central. While I was at Walla Walla Community College, my work study job was at the Washington State Penitentiary teaching ESL and English as a second language. I mean ESL and adult basic ed. So throughout my career, I thought I want to be a teacher. And then I went to Central, go Cats. That's what I said earlier. Central Washington University, go Cats. Yep. And then I said, okay, this social services thing, that's kind of cool. That's kind of what, helping people. So that's kind of what I based my career on. Then I graduated and thought, what am I going to do with my life? And I didn't know. So I ended up falling into social services, helping parents get off of public assistance and into the economy and getting jobs. And so my background really prepared me for that as being a child in poverty. And just throughout, I've just felt that this is a calling for me. So, in a later question, I'll talk about a bill that I testified for last session and just of the work that we do. And so I found the South Central Workforces. We're a local workforce development board, which there are 12 across Washington in the communities that you may live in. And so I just thought, hey, this is my home. And I kind of grew up in that. And all the things we do. We help businesses and we help job seekers. So I always say to my staff, one of them that's here is the chicken and the egg. We help both because you can't have a healthy economy if you don't help both.
Thank you, Amy.
Good morning, buenos dias. It's so nice to be with you all this morning. Well, I mean, Amy and I, when we prepared for this, we realized we have lots of connections. But I was born and raised in Delridge, which is a few blocks away from Bethlehem Steel at the time, which is now Nucor, and right near Duwamish River. But I was lucky that my dad, he was at a factory in Georgetown. And so even though he grew up in Mexico, his father was murdered when he was a child. His mother, came across the river and lived on the border, working in the fields in segregated Southern Texas. In the 50s, he left at age 14 and ended up in Oregon, working as a farm worker, and then finding his job in Seattle. And so by the time I came around, they had purchased a home, and in his workplace, he had a union. So when he worked overtime, he got overtime. When he worked holidays, he got triple pay. He had healthcare benefits. And so I grew up with healthcare benefits. I grew up being able to play sports. But when I went to college, I always had heard stories about my dad, and so came to meet farm workers that were living the same life as my dad 40 years later. And it really just made me upset and asking questions of like, why? And so looking at systems and institutions and policies got me to Olympia for the first time after visiting Mattawa and the Columbia River and seeing children living along the river because there wasn't any housing built for them. Got me lobbying for farm worker housing and looking at issues around affirmative action and I-200. So those are my early activism. I actually came down because of Adelante, which was founded by Lolo Arevalo, who's here as a public servant. So just very connected to Yakima. So it's great to be here. But I grew up on the West Side, and for me, it was kids getting locked up, including one of my childhood friends getting locked up at the age of 14 for a crime. But he was locked up for life without parole. And so come full circle, I worked as a union organizer and a community leader and an activist, but always looking at like how to push on the institutions to have them be more responsive and reflective of my community and my experiences. That led me to get appointed as a state senator when my senator went to Congress, and I came in as in the minority in the Senate at the time in all the ways, the only woman of color, and my party was not in control at the time. And so to now being able to like shape policy and full circle of having my friend, because of what we know about science and children's development, had a chance to have his case relooked, have his sentence relooked at, and now is out at age 42 and went to law school at Gonzaga and is an attorney now, working and really making a difference in his community. So that is one version of my story. But is one of the reasons why I ended up where I'm at. And I'm really passionate about, making sure that institutions and our legislative process gets demystified, and really excited for the conversation.
Thank you, Senator. Rep. Corey.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Palm Springs of Washington. No doubt you saw that sign as you drove in. It's a little tongue in cheek, but I love it. I think it embodies a lot of our spirit out here, even if we're not actually like Palm Springs. I grew up so I've got a lot of stuff against me being a legislator from Central Washington. I grew up in California, and I went to the University of Washington. So I'm not a Coug, and I'm from California. But please don't hold that against me. My wife is from the Yakima Valley, born and raised. Her family goes back a couple generations here. And when we actually were living back in California when we were pregnant with our second child. And I wanted a place where I could be around family, that I could have a support structure. California was pretty crazy. It was tough to buy a home. It was, you just felt like a number down there. And we had been visiting Yakima a lot since obviously we were dating and got married. So I suggested we move here, and that was so my daughter's 13, so it was about 13 years ago. And it was probably the best decision we ever made. I love this community where there's a level of connection, responsibility. People know you. You can't drive like you're from California here. That took a little bit of adjustment. Shockingly, I've never gotten a ticket in this town. Anyways, so fast forward to joining the legislature. I probably was sharing a lot of goals like a lot of my peers at the time. I was in my early 30s trying to figure out like, okay, we want to buy a house. We want to, do all these things for our kids, let them have access to things that we didn't have access to growing up. How do we do that? And so worked, a lot. My wife and I both had jobs, and happened to have a job where this opportunity came up with a retiring state rep. And one of the tough parts about being a citizen legislature is you have to drop everything you're doing and go to Olympia for 3 to 4 months. And not a lot of people can do that, which means that the pool that goes there, may not always be reflective of all parts of the state, right? Just a reality of some people can't just leave their jobs. And so luckily I had a career at the time where they were supportive of it. And they said, sure, yeah, go ahead and go over. And it's worked out really well. I've been able to focus on a lot of areas that I didn't even realize going in that I would care about. And the ability, Senator Saldana mentioned it, but the ability to interact with agencies on behalf of individuals has been probably the best part of my job, because when you're an individual going up against the state, it's cumbersome, it's tiring, and there's a never-ending level of bureaucracy to try to get through if you need to get something done. And so our ability to be able to cut through a lot of that, it's been a lot of fun and very rewarding. So
can you hear me?
Brief story.
I appreciate that. Thank
Okay,
you.
hold on.
And it kind of
I'm
guides
trying to
into
mute.
this
I'm
like
trying to
next
mute this
intro
meeting.
question for
This
getting us started, like
minute,
understanding the
but-
legislative
Hold on, I'll
process
call you for myself.
and kind of the bureaucracies around everything that goes into
Okay,
it.
bye.
I will say like this last session was my first session in my role. And so diving into a short session and really like learning all the ins and outs of the dates and the deadlines and all things that come up. So just a question for our legislators, kind of like demystifying and getting into the ideas of like what is all included in the legislative process. When you have an idea that comes to you, an idea that comes from community, how does it go from an idea and go through the legislative process? Can you like give us an overview or like walk us through what the legislative process goes from from starting an idea into maybe a bill signing?
Well, first of all, how many people work for our public servants for the state? Okay. And then how many are community or here representing a nonprofit? So, I mean, I feel like as public servants, you probably actually know quite a bit. But I mean, I think one thing that I learned, is our state legislatures across our nation are all very different. And so we're considered, there's a handful that are full-time, California being one of them. And then there's those that are really direct citizens like Idaho or like Montana, which has 100 senators versus our state, which is kind of quasi professional. So we are part-time and we have, of course, a 2-year budget. So on the long budget years, we have our long session, which is 105 days. And then on our short sessions, where we're just supposedly tinkering and adjusting the budget, sometimes, in my experience, that had just this last year is probably the closest we actually had to tinkering. Usually it's just a whole, almost feels like a whole session in 60 days instead. And so because we are considered part-time legislators, we have either other jobs or a lot of people are retired or, I worked in a nonprofit and had to quit that to do this job and then kind of have a consulting small business that I do as I can, but it is a challenge. So how the process can work. I was thinking that Senator King was going to be here with me, and he and I served on transportation for a really long time together, and him longer than me. And we do a lot around roundabouts. And so I think about there's not a wrong time, and there's any time that you can merge in to the legislative process. But there are obviously times that are better or
Actually
more
got that picture
convenient.
for you.
Oh yeah, I know. So it looks messy, but it does function. And so during this time, which we call the interim time, is when we are more in district and are able to just talk with people about what are issues, understanding what's not working or is working, and we can work with community groups or ourselves or agencies to prepare legislation. And obviously, as public servants, that your agencies, this is a time when they prepare their package and any bills or changes that they want to see to the governor. The governor goes through that process first. Those are agency request legislation. The way that I work is, looking at, communities usually come to me with an ask, and then we work through the process to figure out what's the kind of bill. And so this is the time where we can prepare legislation. We can pre-file bills in December. And then when session starts, you work through the process. You choose, someone has to sponsor it for it to be, become a bill. And then it works through the committee process, the budget process. Then it comes to the floor of your chamber, and then it has to make it over to the other side. So then you switch over again. So in each of those times, there's places where community can help shape and write policy with you, or you can come up with an idea, or an agency comes with an idea and you propose it. And then through the committee process, there's the opportunities to testify with us, make your opinions heard, and those, can happen now thanks to COVID virtually. So you can just sign in and show up from your kitchen and testify, or you can come in person and be before us and testify. And so while it's in committee, there are amendments and changes that can happen as well. But I would say a lot of, especially when it's a community group, the more they can be engaged up front, and the more that whatever agencies are impacted, obviously as people that have to implement, the more that you're engaged throughout the process to be able to help us figure out how best to implement. How can we help make sure that this actually isn't just become a piece of paper, but actually is something that will make a difference in how our work is done as a state and how our citizens and residents experience the policy change.
I think that's very well said. I think I'll add a couple things. One, having a relationship with your local legislator is hugely important. I think that makes a difference to become the subject matter expert in whatever it is. I can say to this person on my right, she is never shy about telling me what her needs, asks, and wants are. And I think that's a good thing. We need to know that. Legislators, contrary to popular belief, don't know everything. And we rely on people in our communities that can help us shape policy and understand how, well, like what the real implications are of a particular bill or law. The biggest pieces of legislation I've ever been able to have moved and signed into law were from people. They weren't my ideas. They were actually both of them were two individuals in our community who really wanted to see something changed, and they brought the idea to me, and I said, all right, I'll work on this with you as long as you're going to be there with me. And that was an understatement on her part. She still calls me, like, we talk like every other week now. But she was, so it was a short session. It was a 60-day session, which I think you do just as much work in a 60-day session as you do in a 105-day session. It's just less time. And I was like, I told her, I said, we're going to introduce this bill now. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get it done. It's a short session. We're kind of late in the process, but we'll try. I think she called your office like 16 times. I know she called Wellman's. I mean, she was just calling, and we got the bill done in a 60-day session. And so that was determination. Obviously, it took a lot of people to make that happen. But that type of work, I think, shows that you can, as a citizen, as an individual, whether it's a nonprofit or even if you're trying to make change within your own state agency or in your personal life, you can, as an individual, make big change in Olympia.
Which is a good segue too for Amy. From the community perspective, I think too, like the senator and the rep were saying, like you have ideas that come from community and they run with these ideas and they become these legislative proposals. From community, is there a way that maybe you prioritize or think through, like, hey, which ideas do we want to prioritize in this limited time span that we have in session? Is there a process that you kind of go through that helps kind of organize that?
So as community, I think that part of that is depending upon what issue that you want to bring up or what is very important to you personally or professionally, find those community groups or advocacy groups that align with that. And then, for example, for us, we are all workforce. So it's education, training, and I can't think of the other one right now because I'm just, thinking of up here on this big spotlight. So that table right there, we don't look at you because it's not that we don't like you. We can't see after we look around the room. So don't take that personal, but so we look at things and we serve around, we cover Yakima, Kittitas, Clickitat, counties in central Washington. And so we serve about 1,500 people that are laid off workers, people in poverty, people of all demographics, people that are working but not making ends meet, youth, gang involved youth, homeless, unhoused youth, all the gamut. So that's what we do in central Washington. So our board is, I have a business-led board. And what that means is private business tells me when I get state and federal funding, how we need to do that through a strategic plan. So we have those things that we want to advocate for and look at. And so if it has anything to do with poverty, anything to do with laid off workers or youth, we go after and do that. And it can be, so that's what I would say is go and find your local groups or your advocacy, like we heard a lot yesterday. That is where you will have like-minded people and just push. And the other thing that I would say too, with Rep. Corey said, is that it takes a lot. My last year was we helped get a bill passed in a short session. And it's a lot of work, but it is well worth it. So I would just say it's well worth it, and get to know your representatives and your senators in your area. And actually, even those that are not in your area, I would say that, because if they have priorities that align with you, they're going to help support that and push their folks on the across the aisle or in their own party. So, and then Senate and House.
Yeah, and I appreciate that point, because I think that is something that's important, is that yes, you might have your local legislator that you can connect with that's in your community, but legislators are on different committees, they have different
Absolutely.
responsibilities in the legislature. And so all connecting with the folks that are, that specialize in whatever topic area that you're in, it's also good to connect with those folks that may be not in your area. So thank you for making that point. I think so. This question isn't really on here, but it's like kind of going off a little bit. Is like I think that the timing that comes into play. And so, yes, like you all kind of touched on how important it is that community drives the pieces of legislation that go through the process. Um, Especially when it comes to like a short session and seeing how fast things need to be turned around and gone through, especially when it comes to like including community and how community can sometimes have limited resources or limited time. Like, is there a way that you balance that, or like how best community can be involved in the process when maybe they can't be there all the time?
Well, I think the senator mentioned it earlier, but Zoom and Teams are our friend, especially on this side of the state for session. I would agree that one of the best things to come out of COVID, if that's a phrase I can use, is the idea of remote testimony. And so we can hear from people. And I think it's better to be in person if you can. But if you can't, coming in on Zoom for our committee hearings is great. I think it's really important. I've seen people testify from their tractors in the field when they're working, and I'm like, that's amazing. Like nobody would have ever thought, 2-3 years ago, that you could hear from people impacted by legislation where they're impacted by legislation. So given that, email, calls, again, back to my point earlier, if you can build the relationship beforehand, you're not playing catch up during session when our attention spans are basically in 10 or 15-minute blocks if we're not in committee. Like we literally will have days where I'll have 3 hours of meetings and 15 minutes meetings. So when I come home from session, I have to like readjust. So like I tell my kids, we can't have any more topics over 15 minutes because I can't focus on it for that long because I'm so conditioned to 15 minutes. But that's where the rebuilding those relationships in the interim, I think, is important.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And so kind of going into this next question, thinking about a little bit around the challenging aspects of navigating the legislative process. Is there things that come up for you during either during session, during the interim, where there are challenges that you kind of that are more regular that you need to kind of work through the process, either timing or different groups that you might meet with that maybe have competing interests or things like that? Anything that come up?
I can talk about that. So first off, I did feel to mention on the last about when I talked about the people we serve, and we do talk to them and what impacts them. So not only do we just do it from our board's perspective, we do get the community input of those that we're serving as well. I failed to mention that earlier, and I just thought about that. So as far as if you've never been a part of the legislation process, it's a little different as a community member because there are timelines when bills have to drop and when you all have to keep our government running and to get them on time. And so they're not there 6-8 months by and what's called sine die, which I just learned. So by the time legislation ends, the session ends, that they have really timelines when bills have to drop, when they go, all this bill making process. So that part, when legislation starts, if you want to drop a bill, it can be too late, but it's not too late. So all working up your fall and spring as a community member, I would say is your summer and fall. Your summer, really meet with your people locally so that you know they're here, they have lives, they are human. You will see them in the store, things like that. So when set up some time, call them and talk to them. And then when fall comes around, if you are with a community group or an advocacy group that does a legislation day or that does an event that they call them specifically to come while in their district to come and learn about what's going on. That's really beneficial. And then the governor drops his budget in mid-December. And so then the House and the Senate both work through the legislative session to agree with the governor or to disagree and where they come on those things. And so that's a lot what the session is about. The other part when Rep. Corey was talking about the 15 minutes, it's like speed dating. I've gone to his office in Olympia and you are with 15 minutes and his LA or legislative assistant will come in and say, okay, now your next time is up. And so one thing, don't take it personal. It's they want to hear from you and they did hear you, but they have to be timely. And then they will come out and go and they'll go on the floor, they'll go on caucus to do things. And so it is this very big process. The other thing, I'm going to age myself a little bit, how a bill becomes a law, a bill on Capitol Hill. It is kind of like that, but it's not, they left a lot of things out, just, so, but it's a great start to that. But yes, those are laughing because there's a lot of people that are my age around here, I noticed, after school special people. But that's what I would just say, just it may seem foreign to you as a community member if you've never done it before. I've done 2 sessions. I have one up on Omar now. So yeah, I'm a little bit more experienced, but it is definitely worth it. And I know more and more every year. So definitely be engaged, and they do want to hear from you.
Yeah. I feel like I think something you said made me, no, yeah, made me think of a couple things. I think a piece, as someone that works a lot with community groups, you know, and I've, you know, when to be opposed. So when there's a bill that you're like, you know, this is gonna change my job, this is not good. You know, I think there's different tactics of how to approach that, right? In terms of, you know, raising concerns. And especially if you're talking with the prime sponsor or talking with others, like how you engage folks to be able to make sure that they do not dismiss you and they are actually like listening to your changes. So I see a lot of legislative liaisons in the room, or people have worked with us and, you know, are great resources for you and for your communities, is, you know, is actually talking with agency legislative liaisons about their strategies and how they work. Is a great way to be able to support community groups when I'm thinking about equity. And I'll say, like, since I was part of leadership when we took the majority in the Senate, and, you know, we created the Office of Equity. We have, which I know has done a lot, has really grown over that time period. And one of the things that we tell our chairs is, you know, it's a short session, and how are, you know, one of the criteria is that the majority caucus uses, and, you know, you should use our language, is how you're putting people first. And so you can put your people first in all kinds of ways. But I think when we're hearing agency request legislation or community, you know, or legislation that's coming before us, it's, you know, who did you take into account? Like, who helped shape this policy? Have you talked to, have you considered unintended consequences? You know, have you thought about how this is improving, you know, lives of for people that are furthest from opportunities? Is it geographically, you know, equitable is a big issue for us, is making sure that this policy, you know, sometimes you really need a specific policy for one community. And so how we draft something so it's not more expansive than it needs to be, but is meeting, you know, helping a community very specifically, or whether it is a big statewide policy, how to make sure that it's going to land and actually work well for Wapato, as well as Spokane, as well as, you know, Vancouver. You know, those are things that, you know, we want to know. The more that you are able to answer those questions, the more prepared that bill is to be able to go through that legislative process. I think the other piece, of course, too, is every year we say we have budget issues. I think this year is going to be a big challenge, and to be able to maintain our current level of service and recognize that many of our agencies, many of our programs, many of our rates have not actually been able to are barely getting to the level they were pre-recession of 2007 and 2008. And yet we've had this whole year of inflation, these years of inflation that have really stressed out our ability to provide the services, and has really stressed out our residents in terms of being able to put food on their tables. And so that is going to be a big concern for this next legislative session. So when we're thinking about what are the things that we can do that you know, are budget conscious, and is going to be something that will be important when you have a really great bill and everyone wants to support it. And yet if it's a new program, like, how are we finding the revenues to actually make that happen? is not insurmountable, but it is definitely something that I've noticed. And that's part of why when we do legislation, we kind of go step by step. Sometimes you just do the study or the work group to be able to kind of like make sure that we are being able to assess out more of the issues, to be able to have a policy and a program that can implement with full support and the actual funding that's needed to make it happen.
Yeah, really appreciate the conversation. And I think too, you bring up the role of state agencies. And so that's another aspect is like, we have the different branches of government. And like we said, we have a lot of state folks here in the room with us. And, virtually we have our state employees also and community members. And I think that's the other thing to bring up is how would you say to your relationship is kind of with agencies and conversations with agencies as you work through different legislations, like agency request legislation that might come through, talking through with agencies, because something we'll all admit to is that agencies work in silos. The agencies don't really talk to each other, and so we have agencies that maybe are working on the same bodies of work when it comes to like maybe healthcare access, transportation, things like that. Like, is there ways that work, especially with our state employees in the room, methods that you find helpful, useful, going through the process when you're working with maybe agency request legislation or things that, very directly impact maybe how a state agency functions?
So as on appropriations, I get a lot of second looks at policy bills that have fiscal implications, and that's the money part. Yep, the money part. And so I've got agency, I call them lobbyists. There's what liaisons? They're lobbyists. They're for the state agency, right? I mean, that's what they do. They advocate for their agency, and they're in my office. They're calling, texting, emailing me with details. So I don't know what the rules are in a state government, but if you're working on something and you've got the technical expertise or detail, I'm hoping that you're in connection with your government affairs people at your agency, because then you're able to advocate for whatever it is you're trying to do. Because oftentimes I'm not talking to the individuals in the agency, I'm talking to the government affairs person or the director. And so that would be my suggestion in terms of how you handle that.
Thank you. And so for this next question, kind of diving a little deeper into actual legislation and kind of examples of how once legislation is passed, how it's maybe implemented and how like it maybe affects community. And so can you share an example of a piece of legislation that was directly influenced by community input and what that process looked like, and maybe a little bit more about the piece of legislation?
Well, and I think, I mean, I'm also interested in if people have questions, but I'll use one because I just recently had an opportunity to do some reflection on it. But I represent a district that is I call where the world calls home, because and it has every refugee and immigrant community, our historic Black community, our Jewish community. People have landed when they land to Seattle, often they land in that part of the city. And so I have a lot of cultural centers. And so when I worked for the Justice for Janitors Union, I got to meet a lot of the refugee community. And I knew that many of the people that are working as janitors or Uber drivers or interpreters have professions from their home countries, but because of barriers, they're not able to benefit. And so the Somali Health Board, folks brought this idea of that they have we have medical graduates that are not able that want to practice. And it was around the same time where the Latino Health Center at UW had done a study about, the need for more Latino doctors and just in general, more doctors and healthcare providers that have language, that have culturally competency and connection to the populations that need access to healthcare. And so they brought this idea, and I had heard, that they had tried before and weren't able to get anything through because there's, federal barriers to be able to create this pathway for IMGs is what they call themselves. But, so I was like, well, let me see what I can do. And they had done their homework. They saw that Minnesota had done something already. So we looked at Minnesota. And so we were trying to, they had a piece of drafted legislation that would have created a program. And, so I did reach out to the agencies and the medical association, and I saw that there was a lot of like hesitancy, and especially the University of Washington and WSU had just started their medical program. And so, and I didn't want that hesitancy to be something that would be a no. And so we worked through like adjusting, like, let's try to get everyone at the right table. So that was our first bill. It was just a draft of how to get everyone to the table with desired outcomes, so that they had to be at the table and work through these issues, and they couldn't just say, no, it can't be done. And when we started this process, I mean, the international medical graduates are a very impressive, amazing group from all over the world. I mean, the Somali community are the ones that I was more connected with, so a lot of East African, but it was everyone, Eastern Europe, Asia, Central America, Jamaica. I mean, amazing people that are living in every part of our state that have the skill and want to provide this service, but weren't able to. And so it took three other bills. So they came back with recommendations. We did the next bill. That was another, and when people heard the story, I mean, it didn't matter. I mean, it had major bipartisan support. Everyone was impressed with these when they came through the health committee, when they came to the Ways and Means Committee. And so it was, because we did this and they were able to tell their story and come down, they built their own champions. And it wasn't me. So the next, another senator did the next version, another senator did the next version. And so I think that is something that you may not experience with all of us. Some of us care more about our name on the bill, but I think a lot of us, want to see good policy. And so for me, it was really important that all the senators saw that this was their bill that they wanted to see through, because it built a lot more momentum for that bill. And now they have a program, and they were just here in Yakima a couple months ago, because they have two IMGs that are now working with a license, and they have built capacity, I think, to see another 10,000 more people than would have been seen, and have access to a primary care provider. And so this is a program we did as a pilot, because again, people were concerned. So now next year they are ready to ask one of us to sponsor a bill to make sure that the pilot becomes a permanent program. And part of that will be revenue, but it is one of those stories where it was really passion from the community and pushing and saying, why can't it be done? And then, really, as Representative Corey said, it was, I will be happy to do this. I am not an expert in healthcare or any of these things, but I will walk with you if you guys show up. And they definitely showed up more, very prepared. And so I think it's just a really heartening thing to have them tell me that their story, and that they're seeing success. And they really initially didn't trust me. And I wasn't sure. I mean, in terms of like, why are you just doing a work group, right? Like, you're just going to do this and then that's all it's going to be. And it was us both kind of building relationship to say like, well, I have a commitment to see it all the way through. But all I know is that how to take the first step. And sometimes that's how you do legislation. That's democracy. It's super messy. It's like, you don't know, you won't know where you want to go, but you don't know the path. And it's really like, can you start the first path, first step forward? And I think the other piece, just for me as like a North Star, is, as I do policy, I'm trying not to do more harm, right? Because I feel like a lot of the policies that have been in place were done in a way that actually created harm. And so part of my job is to remove some of those laws and those policies, and then, be careful as we're moving new policies forward, because we only can see as far as we can see. And even when we are using equity and we're trying to bring more people to the table, we know that when you're doing systems and policy, it's always imperfect, because one size doesn't fit all. And yet when we are trying to do something at the state level, we have to have some kind of like structured system. And so none of it is perfect. And so I think that's where public servants and legislators come in place, is like, how do you make sure that you're bringing your own ability and agency to be able to interpret, so that you are putting the human touch on it and making sure that it isn't something that is becoming a new barrier for people.
Really, couldn't agree more. I think a couple things I want to add, and then I'll tell an agency story of a piece of legislation I worked on. So it's a little bit different, but you'll oftentimes assume that when a bill is introduced, it is perfect. This is your perfect baby. There is nothing wrong with this baby. And then it goes to the first committee and they change it. And they're mean to your baby, and you're upset because you have the most beautiful baby in the world. Why would anybody be critical of this baby? That was a lesson I learned my freshman year, was that nothing is ever perfect, and that you are dealing with, what is it, 48 other colleagues who all have their insights and input on this bill, and they have just as much of a right to do that as anyone else in the legislature. So expect change, expect pushback. Most of the time it's out of with good intentions most of the time. And so you just have to be willing to adapt and adjust and be willing to be flexible and assume that, like Senator Saldana said, we may not be able to do the entire thing. We may have to take a bite off it. And oftentimes on a lot of these, we're building the plane as we're flying it, right? Through this process, trying to figure out how it all works. My biggest example that I think is pertinent to this room is when I had a bill my freshman year. So DNR leases a lot of state land out to various interests. We have a lot of ag leases out here in Central Washington, and one of the things in every DNR lease is a very predatory clause that allows DNR to basically originally kick you off your land with 60 days notice. And if you're in farming or ranching, that is not like, you can't just move crops, you can't move fences, structures. I mean, to me, it was wrong, right? So there was no tenant rental protections for lease landowners with the state. And so I introduced a bill that I thought was perfect, right? I was like, this is great, you just can't do it. And of course, the Department of Natural Resources came in and said, we disagree. And so there was a big fight that first year, nothing got done. Second year, and over that summer, an interim, I said, I got the agency together, I got different agriculture groups together, cattle, Farm Bureau and others, and I said, what do we do to fix this? Because there's obviously a problem here. You got to create some certainty. I understand that DNR has a responsibility for getting the most value out of the land possible, but this seems crazy given the amount of like infrastructure, time, money, and costs that go into putting this stuff up. And so through that course of that 9 months, we actually came to an agreement. So by the time I came to the next session, my short session, I introduced a bill. It still had a little tweaks to it through the process, but had support from two people that a year ago were diametrically opposed to each other. So that is a lesson in, again, it may not get done this year. You may have to take a bite of it. Nothing may move the needle that year. There's times where we'll introduce bills we know they're not going to pass that year, but we want to start that conversation. We want to make sure that when there's an interim assembly days or committees are meeting, that's a work study that we're talking about it, because these are big policy shifts in a lot of areas.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. Amy?
Okay. Yeah, so those state workers and maybe people in the community have heard of the Poverty Reduction Work Group under Governor Inslee that that is people that are impacted by poverty, and there's a steering committee, and they are helping our state basically how to serve them, what's not working with our state agencies, and so that was done several years ago. And about 5 years ago, there was a program called, and if you're on the PAIR awards, Economic Security for All, or EXA. So EXA was put into a pilot program 5 years ago with federal funding. And local workforce boards like myself operated those in the community to help get people out of poverty and into jobs. As over the 5 years, it was tweaked a little bit. Are we doing income adequacy? Are we looking at, do they become self-sufficient, not relying on any? And so over the 5 years, it was tweaked a little bit. 2 years ago, actually, yes, three, I'm looking, Megan already left, but 3 years ago, we tried to put, the local workforce boards tried to put forth a bill, wanted to put a bill forward and asked for one of the agencies to do what's called a decision package, which is agency request. and we could not get anyone to pick it up the first time. We had lots of meetings with our state agency partners, with people, local legislators. It just was not that first year. The second year we tried again, and we worked that first year to say, okay, where are we doing wrong in this agency legislation? Who will pick it up? The Employment Security Department did pick that up 2 years ago and put it in and secured some state proviso money, which means it was just in the budget year, we got a little bit of money. And so then we worked on perfecting it, working with the people, showing outcomes, worked in various community groups on how this was working. And last year, as this program has 5 years, we said, okay, I was in a meeting with Mayor Gregerson, which is in the audience, and Megan Matthews from Office of Equity. And it was about, because we cover Skamania County, and it was about a lot of people that in a very west end of Skamania County, closer to Vancouver, is very wealthy, but the people that do the jobs there can't even buy a house because it's so expensive. And so that was that meeting and talking about how do we help people self-sufficient. Mia said, what do you guys have on the docket this year? And Director Matthews says, well, let's get EXA signed into law. And I'm sitting there go, yes, let's do that. And so that's really what it spurred it. And then Employment Security Department took that, and because it was one of our legislators said this is a great idea, they could run with it. And so then and this was November, mind you, and session starts in January. So we then worked for a month and a half to get a bill worked out, at least good enough to drop, like Representative Corey said, in January. Went on the Hill. It ended up going through the House Health and Human Services first. I've never testified in the legislature. The fastest 2 minutes, 1:45 seconds of my life. And if you ever do it, don't be afraid of that that red light. Don't be afraid of it. It will come on and you just finish your thought. And so it was really, and you know, and I shared earlier that I was a child of poverty in Grant County. Well, one of my local representatives was, Representative Dent was on that committee and knew me as a child. And so, of course, that made it really, really nerve-wracking of him sitting in the audience and listening. So I did that. But basically, we had also people that were in the programs testify, and then went through the House caucus. They went in and testified, were brought in on spontaneously to do that and tell his story, and is in healthcare. And businesses that came out, the building trades came out and said how this helps them. So community really made it happen. So I will just tell you, yes, it was an agency legislation, but it was made it happen because people in our communities went and spoke how this was beneficial. So it is it is in law now, and it is we do have some money that sustainable funding, but we're still tweaking because when bills, programs like this become permanent, then you have to report to the legislature how it's doing. And so there may be little tweaks along the way, but the biggest thing is we're changing lives in Washington. So it was very great to be a part of that.
That's very exciting. Thank you, Amy. And so kind of switching gears just a little bit, and then I think we're going to start maybe getting some questions from our audiences. When it comes to, and I think we touched on it a little bit, thinking through like when we're trying to have community voices included in these processes, is there any other barriers that you see that come up for communities to access? And one thing that does come up for me is, we're in Yakima and we do have a lot of Spanish speaking populations in the area. And so thinking that as one of those barriers, is there other things that are top of mind for you all as people are navigating the process, especially during session? We're talking about how, with a short session, how time can be really limited.
Well, I mean, I will say things that are frustrating to me about the legislative process is that it is considered part-time. So as compared to agencies, it was like, have I come back to high school? I mean, when I first got there, I'm like, it felt like very insular and bro-ish. And I'm like, the House is like a group of friends maybe, and the Senate was like a dysfunctional family. You know, you have your uncles, you have your aunts, like you have to work with these people. They come from some people come with all kinds of, everyone comes with their expertise and experience. As I got in to know, I can appreciate, each of them, but they come very quirky because this is not like I'm applying for a job. I mean, you just you can have any skill level as long as you live in that district and you're showing up there. So, you working with my colleagues, like when I first came there was no HR there, there was no supports to like just function as like a regular professional. And so that was an interesting thing. We do have professional staff, like our policy council, our Democratic, so we do have a nonpartisan staff, which are amazing. And our partisan, each of us have like, people that are professionals, that do the work with us, and thank God. But I will say one of the things that was very frustrating to me as someone that represents a very diverse area, is interpretation and language, and just having our websites should be translated. And right now it's dependent on each member to make the request to have their things translated, which comes out of your one office budget, as opposed to like, we should have basic things that like, when you go onto the legislative website, it should be something you can translate. It is not impossible. I have advocated, and I've been in weird positions where I end up interpreting and having it backfire on me because I'm not a professional interpreter. And so this is a place where if you are a community organization or an agency, and people are coming, people can sign up as individuals, but ideally they're connected. And if like you're trying to bring people out, you can request interpreters and when you sign up. So then we can have our professional interpreters, our deaf and sign. We're doing more of that in committee. And then by language, it is something that we are required to do, and we do it, but it's on request, which to me is frustrating because you don't know who's going to show up. And so Spanish, of course, is one of our dominant languages, but we have all kinds of languages, and it would be great to be able to do more of that. And then if you are bringing in a bunch of people that are going to need interpretation, just giving the chair of that committee a heads up, because then they can slow down their process. Like, for instance, it's 2 minutes. They could double it, or like do a panel of folks so they get all 3 of them up at one time, so that they can then make sure that we're giving a little extra time for interpretation. But it is a frustrating process, because once we're in the legislative session, there are these timelines, and there is an increasing pressure, which is not really convenient or accessible, or for a lot of community folks to feel like they are welcome. And I think we have done a better job over the years of training our security. Like, we want security there to be able to help facilitate and welcome. But I know I've had to have many meetings with the security when I have large groups come, because they were, I felt they were profiled, and I felt like they were actually, dismissed, and I had to intervene. So I do think that's a place where working with the when you come in, is making sure you work with our legislative assistants. So I would say, in addition to getting to know us as regular, recognize that your people that represent you, just regular folks. They have regular lives. They have all the same things that you're struggling and juggling with. And then we have one staff person that is dedicated to our office, our legislative assistants, and they are gold. And so making sure that you treat them well, that you're providing support for them, and encouraging them, will make it so much easier for you to be able to access us. But also, they can do a lot. They do a lot for us. And so even meeting with them and getting to know them can be really helpful, because they can help make connections, and be there to help kind of make things easier for when you're bringing constituents or community folks on campus.
Well, I learned something today. I'm gonna go get my website. I just assumed it's 2024. You should have like a button down below. It should be like Copilot, ChatGPT should be able to do this relatively easy, and we can tweak it. All right, that's something we can fix. To that point, most of the stuff we pass is actually very bipartisan. A lot of our bills come across 98 to 0 in the House, 47 and 49. Man, my math is really struggling today. 49. There's 147 legislators. I did the math in my head. And to Senator Saldana's point, you have 147 people who put their name on a ballot because they thought they were good enough to represent other people. So they are quirky. We all are, myself included, right? We all have our weird idiosyncrasies, but it is, for the most part, like a pretty good working group. I mean, we have our moments, right, where we are on diametrically opposite sides, where we will fight, we will get angry, tensions will rise. Sometimes there's yelling, not very often. But then on the next bill, we could all be hugging and crying over something we passed together. It's a very weird work environment. It's funny, by the end of session, I'm so excited to get out of there. And then like a month later, I'm like, I gotta miss it. There's something about it. But we are full-time. We are not part-time, as much as that is what we are claimed. We are working year round. Accessibility is important. We're doing ASL now. And I think all of our committees and floor is now ASL, but I think there's obviously more we can do. The one thing, okay, we were talking about access. We talked about Zoom. That is good. Again, I can't stress enough the outside of session. That is your goal, because I have time to sit down. We all have time to sit down for longer conversations, to take the tours, workforce every year, to understand what's going on. And we, for the most part, I mean, we don't remember everything, but we'll remember those. And when we're in session, we'll have understandings that we didn't have before. So that outside, everybody assumes the legislative session is, that particular period, but I think more can happen outside of that.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And so, Amy, I think just, putting you on the spot, if there are any from the community perspective, I know, like, fun fact, like me and Amy actually met this last session for the bill signing for EXA.
We did.
And so we met there.
We're in a picture together with the governor.
Yeah. And so when it comes to the, all the outreach that you had done, all the testifying and things, is there any barriers that came up for you, or things that like were a little hard to navigate that, maybe might be helpful for folks out in community to just maybe know and maybe be prepared for?
Yeah, I think that it's they make it sound very easy. The legislative sessions is a little bit foreign or weird. I mean, signing in as pro or con on a bill, it's an easy process to do, but when you go to the website and look at it and go, okay, what do I do? So hey, my email, you reach out, or anybody, I can tell you how to do it. It's really quick. We now know how to do it. But first doing that, I did not know, because you can pick, I want to sign in as pro, but I don't want to testify. Or when I did testify, I had to go in and sign as pro, and I am going to testify. And so there's these things, and you have to do it 24 hours in advance, correct? I think about that, something like that. I think it's 24 hours. And so there's some weird little quirky, they talk about they themselves are quirky, but the process is a little quirky too. And it's not something we do every day. So I would just say, if they're, did I get that wrong? Is it? An hour before. That's right. Yes. Thank you so much. That's right. Yeah. We always try to do it 24 hours. Just so we try to do it 24 hours before, so that you know what you have to do. And then two, there's a time, and if you are at home, and you can watch this at any time, if there is something you're interested in, you just search it up on the legislature, look for a bill. If you work with an advocacy group or an agency that that bill number or that proposed bill number, then you can look that up and you can watch it when they're actually there, or on TVW. Did not know we were on TVW, by the way, or in the big lobby when I testify. Someone goes, hey, you were just testifying. What? I was out there? Oh my gosh. So, but it's okay. It was really fine. It was fun. That was all I would say. It's a little bit awkward at first, because this is not something we do every day. I get better at it. The first year it was I first learned how to sign in pro or con. And then this last year I testified, which was even more. But yeah, so I would just say, there are people in the community that are experts on how to do this. See, I haven't said 24 and it's an hour. So call them, connect with them on how to do it, because they do know how to do this. They do it all the time. So. Yes, you go.
So you jogged my memory. You can also sign up on Washington State has very good accessibility and transparency in the system. I have friends that work in other states, and like, we have rules when bills have to be proposed, hearing public notices for hearings. Other states don't have that. So you won't know a bill's coming up until maybe an hour before the meeting in other states. Whereas we have these get scheduled out there. We usually, the chair and ranking will set the schedule for the week prior, it gets posted to the bill book. And if you want, you can follow any bill and the state will email you when it's coming up for a hearing. Any change, anything, you can get notified. So the accessibility piece, if the barrier is just kind of nebulous confusion about how the process works, our website actually is very good about walking you through that process. And we actually have explanation guides as well online. But you can track bills so that it'll tell you anytime there's movement on it, which is really important.
Perfect. Oh,
Sorry,
please
sorry,
go.
if I scratched him. Other thing too, your agencies that your state agencies a lot of times will have bills that they track and post on their website, or community groups will also, they are tracking what they're popular for them. Even your chambers of commerce and some of your economic developments will also do that. So just connect and troll their websites a little bit to see right before session or during session of what they're tracking, and because some you'll really like, others may not. Even I think education does as well.
I appreciate that. And I think that leads me into the last question. And then as our panelists are answering, I'm going to be out in the audience to maybe any questions that we have from the audience. And then virtually, if there's any questions that we might have, take a couple of those questions as well, time permitting. So on that point of like, different organizations are tracking their own bills, all these, I think quirky is the theme of today's session. Understanding like if there's any little points that folks might be, that helpful hints, tips, and things that you might have that you recommend for folks to understand going through the process. One thing that I would love if it can be answered, because I think this is something I learned recently, is like when during elections, how it might be a little difficult for legislators to I think there's a process where like maybe you all can't do outreach or something. So some rules around that I kind of learned. So I don't know if that could be helpful too, to know a little bit more about that. Anything that we should have in mind as far as like rules and things that that maybe prevent you from doing certain things, or just so folks might be aware. So some things that came up for me. But yeah, I'll leave that question up, and I'm going to be in the audience if folks have any questions.
Well, I mean, I think I don't think I have much to say. I mean, I can speak to the legislative process or the election cycle of things, right? So we're elected. In the House, it's every 2 years, and in the Senate, it is every 4 years. Although there's appointments, which are a different kind of thing. And so part of us having, and again, this is not the same in every state, but in our state, we do have what we say is like, your fundraising, you can only fundraise during certain times. When you're in session, you cannot fundraise at all. And then the year after you finish a session and you are up for election, you no longer can access your official communications capacity. So if you're up for election, you have, I think, a handful of days, maybe up to a month, I guess, after session to do your last newsletter, update your website, but then it will be frozen. And so you can you still have access to your email, and if people request, you can still do meetings, but the idea is to just make sure that there's a bright line between representing your constituents and doing your official business and campaigning, so that regardless, like constituents, regardless whether they voted for you or not, they're your constituents, and you need to be able to be accessible and responsive to them. And so there's that. And so you don't want it. I mean, the idea is that you don't want to demonstrate favor because someone's giving you a check, or because they are committed to vote for you, or and so it's imperfect, but that is the way it is. And so it is a little frustrating because for instance, we have a Latino Democratic Caucus for the first time this last year, or it was formed because we have enough of us now in there to be a caucus. But most of my colleagues, except for 2 of us or 3 of us, 2 of us are not running for anything right now. And so it makes it hard for, like Hispanic Heritage Month, we should do something out there and like promote that, just, but many of my colleagues aren't able to do that. And so it's a little like hit and miss in terms of our communications.
Election year activities are pretty regulated. Anything we want to do, we have to actually get approval from attorneys, which I actually think overall is a good thing, right? We want to protect taxpayer resources and make sure I don't know if any of you all have seen any messaging that comes from our elected representatives in DC, but they obviously do not have the same rules, because I will see what I'm like, this is obviously an election ad, and it's like paid for with federal dollars, and I'm like, that's a problem. So I think we err on the side of caution, but I think overall it's a good thing. It can be frustrating because we think, well, this isn't really election, but our attorneys are like, yeah, it kind of is. But I think it protects taxpayer money, and I think that's a good thing.
Perfect. Thank you. And so have an audience question for the panel. So yeah, thank you.
Hey y'all, my name is Tiana Martinez. Pronouns are she, hers. Also, go cats. Um, my question is a bit multi-pronged, so just please respond to whatever stands out. So I think about how one, based off of y'all's responses, I have such good faith that you all are thinking about equity and listening to the members of your community. With that said, as you have heavily hinted at, the process of legislation is deeply convoluted, and people are showing up as they are, not necessarily steeped in the same understanding of equity and social justice that you all might carry. So I'm curious about what can be done to bring people on that other end of the diametrically opposed side of shifting culture when we talk about equity. So that's one piece, is like shifting culture within the legislative processes, the people who impact decisions. How do we shift culture so that people have that shared understanding of equity? I also think about spheres of influence. You were just talking about ads, and I heard a lot of information about how community members can show up to speak and testify on behalf of themselves and their community. But I also understand that these larger corporations have more time, power, money, and resources to lobby for what they want to see happen. And what do we do to equalize that? Just maybe some input on those spheres of influences. And then also on policy writing, I myself am pursuing an MSW right now, and something that I note is that something like 7.5% of MSWs go into macro social work, and an even smaller percentage go into policy. And I find that troubling, because the majority of social welfare policy is then de facto being written by people who don't have social work experience. And I'm curious what you all think we could be doing to bring social workers to the table to help create policies that are steeped in sustainable practices, or have more instructions on how to implement those policies. Because I've been on the side of project management in Seattle for DESC, running how a permanent supportive housing project for adults with comorbid disabilities. And sometimes I think, who wrote this? Who came up with this? So yeah, that's shifting culture within legislation, spheres of influence, and policy writing. No big deal. Just a little bit of a question there.
I'll take your last point, because that struck a chord with me. So I was on my first 4 years, I was on human services and early learning, and we talked a lot about the foster care system. And my wife and I are both foster and adoptive parents. And so I had a lot of real world experience. And to your point, you're right. A lot of times you were taking a very clinical approach to human beings who are not very clinical, right? Like we're flawed. Humans are flawed, right? And so situations that may make sense purely on paper, we're going to do X, then Y, then Z, don't often translate in the real world. So a couple things. One, it's making sure that when you're drafting and crafting this legislation, that we've got policy experts, we've got nonpartisan staff that are amazing, but maybe you're right. Maybe they don't have necessarily the on the ground experience to write that. Making sure that we bring in people who are affected by this. And that means, again, the work before session is where that can really happen, because once you're in session, you can shift stuff, but it becomes really hard to do. And so to your point, making sure that when we're crafting legislation, we're aware of where the impacts are and making sure that they're part of that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I have had the privilege of having a mom that was a social worker, and I mean, trained at least. She actually was our family social worker for the whole family. But I do think the value of having social worker and having diverse disciplines within policymaking is really helpful. So I will just say, plug. I mean, I know y'all have a job right now, probably, but you should consider working in the legislature. We do have nonpartisan positions, and yes, many of them have that you don't need to have a master's in any specific category to be able to be a policy writer. And I think having diversity, and we've hired some really great people that have MSWs that have been our policy council that then work to, have moved to the governor's office. And so I think thinking about it's an incredibly frustrating and exciting and amazing opportunity to work through in the legislature, because you are working on a million different policies, and having more ability to have different diversity in the room, to be able to do that intersectional like questioning that you get when you have different people with different expertise there is really important. And so I just would ask you to consider coming to work for us. And we have internship program that has been a great way for us undergrads to expose them to work embed in our offices. Our nonpartisan Senate Committee Services, and yours is office of firm. They also do policy. They also have policy internships positions that are, so you can be able to embed and get an experience. I think, that inviting, and if you are an agency and you're working in a place, inviting our, not just us, but our policy staff to come and engage with you, to do a day on the job. And some of them do that on their own. But I think you like being proactive and engaging them to be able to see how you're doing this implementation, whether and so I feel like those are some things. I mean, I think a big piece is this constant tension of wanting to do lots of change because you see all of the harm and the things in the world. And also, working in community, you have to go at this pace of change, which is sometimes slow. And so I think that's the tension, is like you'll have communities saying you need to do this. And at the same time, that community does not want you to do those things so quickly without them at the table. So I will say one thing, of course, that I care about a lot, and many of you guys are impacted by it, is the HEAL Act, which puts environmental justice into statute and covers 7 of our agencies, and any other agency can voluntarily opt in, for the record. And it is really a messy process. The EJ Council still, has its tension. The sub cabinet, I know is tension, but I think the whole purpose of, and that was a messy bill, and it could probably use some tweaks, but the whole purpose of how I attempted to do that bill with the communities, the environmental justice communities, and working with some of our tribes, was that how you do it and outcomes both matter. So, who's at the table and how are you doing the identifying the problems, identifying the solutions, working with community, and then being able to make sure that you're partnering with communities in the outcomes as well. And I think the poverty reduction task force, was another really great example of how many agencies came to that table to look at how are we improving outcomes. And I think more of that collaborative opportunities where we're getting out of our silos and looking in and out is another way where we can actually like really affect change. And I think not being afraid of community partnerships. So like where can we partner with community to do education and engagement and enforcement, has been one of our places of innovation of like, how do we make sure that we're being responsible with taxpayer dollars? And I think the other piece for me is how are we making sure that we are creating budgets and space for innovation and to be able to make mistakes in public together, because that's how we're going to do better policy. But it is hard because there is, a tendency with the revenue, and when you get on Ways and Means or appropriates, where it feels so easy to get to scarcity as opposed to thinking about it in a more abundant way of like, we have strengths and assets, how are we leveraging the assets in our communities? How are we leveraging to like, and then having the government be a partner in that? So, I mean, I don't know if that answers it, but I think that is the place of like how much we can stay in the discomfort and the tension place, as opposed to just defaulting back to, okay, we just need to get done because, and so I think as public servants that have lots of pressures on you, and as community that has lots of pressures on you, I think that's our tension, is like we all are just so busy just trying to get to where we're going. But I'll just say it's because it's on my mind. It's the people I met with yesterday are, but if we're doing it too fast to get to the end point, people are dying. And especially when we're thinking about driving, which I just spent a couple hours getting over here, we have more fatalities because people get in their vehicles and they are just hell bent on getting to their destination so quickly that they are having these horrific accidents. And it's not, there's no enemy there. It's each one of us, right? And so I think about like each day, if we're just trying to rush to get to the place and are missing the opportunity to connection and recognize that we are moving through people's communities, that we are moving in other people's spaces, I think we're going to get better policy and we'll hopefully save more lives.
Thank you. And so I was hoping to fit one more question, but we are actually running out of time. And so I just want to actually close up our panel. One last question that I have for you all as we get into this upcoming session, this long session. We have transitions in the administration too. I just want to put like a fun thing out there. Like, what are you looking forward to during this next session? Something.
That's a great question. I actually am looking forward to going back. I said it earlier. I genuinely enjoy the work. It's fun. There's a lot of collaboration. There's sometimes where we're not as collaborative, but that's okay. I look forward to seeing my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. For the most part, it's a sane working environment. There's some interesting moments, but I just like the chance to serve the state. And it's a lot of fun that that what you're doing matters. And I always tell kids when I go talk to like schools, everybody's worried about the federal government and the president, the vice president, all that stuff. And I'm like, they don't impact your life nearly as much as you think they do. Whereas like us as a legislature, we determine how many courses you have to take of X, Y, or Z in order to graduate. So pay attention to state and local government because that's where things happen. So I'm glad to get to play a role in that.
Amy?
Oh, nope, there it is. Oh, for me, it is, we do a hill visit or a hill climb every January, February. So we're going to be February. So I will be seeing this gentleman for 15 minutes in February again. Oh, yes, I get 5 more minutes. But that's the piece. And others too. We, not only do I see my locals, I see various across the states. So yeah, that's what I'm looking for, is just seeing them again and watching our legislative process work. I think that if you've never ever been to see it, I would recommend just go. It is an amazing process. I've taken our children to do that. So just go. I mean, just go and watch and see it. And it's just amazing to be a part of that. So
I think welcoming people to Olympia and to remind them that this is their state capital. And again, like what Amy said, like whatever your issue is, there is a group and a day for that. And you don't have to come on the day, but it does feel really empowering if you care about early education, or you care about corrections, or you care about education. Coming on those days to feel like you're not alone. There's actually a lot of residents and there's ways to collaborate and make connections. And I'll say the last thing is like, it's a long session, which means we get to celebrate Dolores Huerta Day in person, and Cesar Chavez Day, which are 2 holidays that you don't get the day off, but you actually get to, be able to celebrate and honor them. And those are really fun days to come to Olympia too.
Awesome.
I would say too, there's theme days like Potato Day, there's Dairy Day, there's those things, there's Beef Day. So yes, if you can go on one of those theme days, they are very good. You get 1 free food. So, and ice cream. So yeah, go to those two because it's kind of fun.
Definitely looking for beef day for sure. That's one of my favorites. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Rep. Corey, Amy, and Senator Saldana for joining us today. Really appreciate the time. And yes, thank you. Just gonna close us out. Thank you everyone for joining us today.